This is Gary Stieber with a message from Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 11 through 26. Let's start off with a question here. When the check engine light comes on in your car, how quickly do you get it checked out? Now, some people will get it checked out instantly, and some people will check it out, eventually, hoping that it will kind of go away or that the problem isn't too big of a deal. And then there's another category of people who might just put a piece of tape over the check engine light so they don't have to look at it, and they'll just ignore it altogether. Now, God's Word gives ample warnings to us for a whole host of issues, and we saw in a previous lesson that when we obey God's desires for us and we apply course corrections when we've gone astray, generally things will go well for us. But when we refuse to do that, and if we refuse again and again and again, generally we can expect that bad things may happen. And what we're going to see today is the outcome of repeated warnings to Tyre, a proud and arrogant nation with one of the most incredible analogies in all of the Bible. Let me ask you another question. Is your picture of God one that imagines that He delights in doling out judgment and punishment? Well, in Ezekiel chapter 26, God gives Ezekiel a prophecy against Tyre that calls for its destruction. Then in chapter 27, God tells Ezekiel to take up a lamentation for Tyre. A lament is a song of sorrow. It's not a victory dance. And we see the same pattern in chapter 28. The difference is that the subject in chapter 26 and 27 is the city of Tyre, and the subject in chapter 28 is the king of Tyre. And in this we see a warning from the Lord for sure, but it also reveals to us something about the heart of the Lord as well. And Ezekiel speaks more of Tyre than any other prophet. Now, who is Tyre? Well, Tyre is the capital of Phoenicia, and it's on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in a southern part of what today is known as Lebanon. It's about 40 miles south of Beirut, and it's about 100 miles north of Jerusalem. Now, the people of Tyre were skilled in arts and crafts, but what really set them apart is their dominance in seafaring. They made advances in the building of ships that allowed them to sail direct routes over the open waters of the Mediterranean with larger cargoes. And this was in a time when most ship travel for most people was done by hugging the coastline and moving from one port to the next port and to the next one. And this made them a major center of commerce, which made them very, very wealthy and very powerful. Now, you might remember Hiram was the king of Tyre in the time of David and Solomon, and they had very friendly terms. Tyre provided a lot of the material and craftsmen as well for the building of the temple and the palace in the time of Solomon. That's recorded in 2 Samuel 5, 1 Kings 5, 1 Kings 14, and so on. But in the books of Amos and Joel, both of which were written roughly 200 years after Solomon, it indicates that Tyre was involved in the selling of Israelites as slaves to places as far away as Greece and Edom. That's recorded in Amos chapter 1 and Joel chapter 3. So it's clear that at that time they've fallen away from their neighborliness of the prior generations. And judgment comes upon Tyre for two primary reasons. As God begins to judge and punish the Israelites, Tyre celebrates. And it's another one of those, hey, look, we can do more and get more without having you as a neighbor kind of a thing. And what's the root of that? The root of that is pride. And if we look at that carefully, we'll get a message that's very relevant to us today. And the word pride or proud is used over 100 times in the Bible and never in a good sense. Proverbs 18:12 says, "Before destruction a man's heart is proud, but humility comes before honor." Now, the Bible is full of illustrations of the consequences of pride. We see that in Haman in the book of Esther. We see that in Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4. We see it in Herod Agrippa in Acts chapter 12. We saw it in Jazaniah and Pelatiah a couple of weeks ago in Ezekiel chapter 11. You don't have to look far in the Bible to find it, and you don't have to look far in the world today. You don't have to look far in our country today, and maybe you don't even have to look far where you work today to find people that are just consumed by pride. Josh Hunt says that there's no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in other people. And in addition to all of that, the people of Tyre worshipped Baal and Melkarth, two foreign gods. Now, having a seafaring history, the prophecy against Tyre is filled with the language of the sea. He speaks of sails and oars and ships and fish nets and coastlines, the ocean depths and waves, and I see in that God speaking to them in terms that were very relevant to them. And I think that God will speak to you in terms that are very relevant to you. Tyre's Hebrew name is Sur, which means rock, and it's built atop an island off of the Phoenician coast. Tyre was virtually impregnable by sea or by land. And in chapter 26, verse 14, the specific prophecy against Tyre is, I will make you a bare rock. You shall be a place for the spreading of nets. You shall never be rebuilt, for I am the Lord. I have spoken, declares the Lord God. And that was fulfilled by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. Ezekiel described how that was going to happen in chapter 26, verse 12. It reads, They will plunder your riches and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and destroy your pleasant houses. Your stones and timber and soil they will cast into the midst of the waters. And that's exactly what happened. This is what Tyre looks like today. But prior to Alexander, it was an island about a half a mile off of the coast. And Alexander attacked and tore down everything on the mainland, threw it into the ocean, and built a causeway out to the island by doing so. And once that was done, everything there was destroyed as well. You can see this on your online map source. It's often God's style to speak about a local event, but to have a greater illustration in mind, a broader application. And we're going to see that in today's passage. Tyre had great material wealth, and as is often the case with those who made great accomplishments, they felt like they had no need of God. And in that sense, what happens with Tyre is of interest to you and I. See, great prosperity can be our spiritual downfall. Now, we may not be in the category of your favorite billionaire or entertainer or athlete in terms of resources, but chances are, by the world's standards, you are remarkably prosperous. And in chapter 27, God instructs Ezekiel to lament over the judgment of Tyre. God doesn't delight in judgment that has to be dealt. And in chapter 28, the message is directed to the king of Tyre, but the language seems to go beyond any normal human ruler. And this becomes very clear beginning in today's passage, which is chapter 28, verses 11 through 19. But before we get to that, let's just hit a couple of verses that lead up to that in chapter 28. In 28 verse 2, we're told, Because your heart is proud, and you have said, I am a god, I sit in the seat of the gods, in the heart of the seas, yet you are but a man, and no god, though you make your heart like the heart of a god. In verse 2 here, we see the ultimate source of sin, pride. And the concept of being like God is the original carrot on the end of the original stick that many people have chased, but can never get to. And we see this all laid out way back in Genesis 3, the original deception. Speaking of eating from the tree of knowledge of the good and evil, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. That's Genesis 3, verse 5. And in Ezekiel 28, verse 5, he says, By your great wisdom in your trade, you have increased your wealth, and your heart has become proud in your wealth. And it's important to note here that wisdom isn't the problem and wealth isn't the problem. The problem is, who do you ascribe the success to? You see, he doesn't recognize it as a gift from the Lord. At 28 verse 9, he says, Will you say, I am a god in the presence of those who kill you? Now that's a question that ought to get your attention. He says, when the enemy comes crashing through your walls, you go ahead and tell them that you're a god and somehow immune to any kind of retribution, and see how that works out for you. His destruction is not only forecasted, but it's assured. Now let's pick it up in verse 11. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, raise a lamentation over the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, You are the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. In 28 verse 11, the language starts to speak on a more far-reaching basis. He's speaking about the king of Tyre, but it's clear that the language also refers to a second being here. And this section of Ezekiel 28 is very similar to Isaiah chapter 14, especially beginning at verse 12 of chapter 14. There, the destruction of Babylon is forecasted, and it uses the similar analogy to a divine rebel. In Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12, it begins, How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. The reference is clear that there was a member of heaven who was kicked out of heaven, removed from heaven. In Isaiah 14, verse 13 tells us that you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. The issue in Isaiah 14 with the king of Babylon there is similar to what we see in Ezekiel 28, where the king of Tyre refers to himself as a god. The king was filled with pride to the point that he assumes he would be like God, and that directly relates back to Genesis chapter 3. And most commentators agree that Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah chapter 14 are very much related. Now, when he says the word of the Lord came to me, he's stating the obvious here. What follows are the words of God, not the words of Ezekiel. And he says, take up a lamentation. And in the Bible, a lamentation is a song of mourning for the dead. Think about that for a minute. There is mourning for the death of your enemies here. There is no celebration that your enemy has died. Let me ask you a question. Why would there be no celebration in the death of your enemy? That's the natural thing for us, right? Well, we're to model God's love, and God has perfect love for everyone all the time. God doesn't rejoice over the destruction of a person who's lived his entire life in opposition to God's will. He grieves over that. In Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, God grieves over the hardness of the heart of the Pharisees, who thought it was more important to honor the Sabbath than to heal a man with a withered hand. And I think that the ultimate death of that person with the hard heart grieves God more than the hard heart grieved him. Well, why? Because there was still hope for a turnaround in the person with the hard heart when they were alive, but when they're dead, that's all gone. And he references the king of Tyre here. That would be Ethbaal. It might be Ethbaal the second or the third. Some people list him as Ethbaal the second, some people Ethbaal the third. Ethbaal is the Hebrew name. Iddobaal is the Latin name. The point is, this is a reference to a real person in a real place and time. He was king of Tyre from 591 BC to 573 BC. That means he was the king of Tyre when Jerusalem fell in 587 BC. Now, if that name sounds familiar, consider this. Ahab, the seventh king of Israel, he was king from roughly 871 to 852 BC, married Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Tyre, who was Ethbaal the first. Ahab and Jezebel brought the worship of Baal into Israel in a formal way. Ethbaal means with Baal. And it's going to be easy to lose sight of the fact that the subject in all of the discussion here is the king of Tyre as we move forward. He says, you are the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. The Lord isn't saying that you thought you were perfect. He's saying that you were perfect. And they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? God knows beauty, and God knows perfect. He's the only one that really knows what perfect looks like. Let me ask you a question. What would perfect in beauty look like? And the word signet here implies a seal. The Lord's saying you are sealed with beauty. You had inside of you perfect wisdom and beauty. And it's not like God to speak of any man like this, and all of a sudden it seems like the focus has shifted a little bit. So keep in mind here that the subject in this section is still the king of Tyre, but there's an analogy being applied. Verse 13, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle. And crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. And on that day you were created, they were prepared. He says you were in Eden, the garden of God. Now it's clear that the reference is to something other than the king of Tyre here. This directly relates this story and Isaiah chapter 14 to Genesis chapter 3, which is the Garden of Eden story, right? Now, there were only four entities in Eden. There was Adam and Eve, there was God's adversary in the form of the serpent, and there was God. And the pride of the king of Tyre is being compared to one of those four. Now, as destruction of the king of Tyre is forecasted and assured, it's clear that he's not being compared with God. There are some who believe the king of Tyre is being compared to Adam in the garden, but most experts are firm that the analogy is that to a divine rebel, not to a human rebel. And he says every precious stone. Now there's two views here. The gemstones here, they may represent the stones in the breastplate of the high priest, or the gemstones may represent the new Jerusalem, the new Eden, so to speak, and the references to the gemstones in the foundation, and that's found in Revelation chapter 21, verses 19 through 21. You see, we have 9 gemstones recorded here, and in both the priest's breastplate and the foundation in Jerusalem, there's 12 gemstones. So in either case, whatever's being described here seems to be lacking. It isn't complete compared to either one of those two. Now, there's no priestly activities being described in this section here, so hold on to that thought and we'll move along and we'll come back to it. The Hebrew word that's translated as settings here is the Hebrew word toph, which is the word for a timbrel. It's a type of a tambourine. And the word that's translated as engravings is the Hebrew word necheb, and it means sockets or holes. It is a technical term for the work of a jeweler, which makes sense in this context here, but it may also refer to the holes in a pipe, as in a flute, which is another musical instrument. And some see in this a reference not to gold jewelry settings, but to excellent work in music. And some say that whoever's being described here, that part of their perfection described in verse 12 may also include musical ability. And he says, you were created. Whatever is being referred to here was created. In other words, not eternal, not a God, not even God-like. They were created just like everything that isn't God was created. And he says they were prepared. The reference, I believe, is back to the precious stones and whatever they represent. So let's hold on to that thought for a moment and move along. Verse 14, you were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. Now what's a cherub? A cherub is a divine being. And certainly neither Adam nor Eve were anointed divine beings. The analogy being applied to the king of Tyre can only be to Satan, as is Isaiah in chapter 14, where the same analogy is applied to the king of Babylon. These are the only two places in the Bible where the pride of a human being, equating themselves as God, brings an analogy of being to some degree like Satan. Now, Michael Heiser, who's a PhD in Hebrew and a scholar in residence for Logos Software, he has a note on the Satan. In the Old Testament, the word Satan is not used to name God's great enemy. Now, God certainly has a great enemy in the Old Testament, but the word Satan is never used in the Old Testament as a proper name like it is in the New Testament. The word Satan in the Old Testament always has the word "the" as the definite article attached to it. The great enemy of God is identified as the Satan in the Old Testament. Now, we wouldn't refer to me as the Gary, and it makes sense. It doesn't make sense in English, and Heiser says that it doesn't make sense in Hebrew either. There is no proper personal name that carries the definite article in either English or Hebrew. And the word Satan is used 27 times in the Old Testament, 14 in the book of Job alone, and the definite article is on every one of them. In the Old Testament, Satan was never meant to be used as a name. It's a role. It's a job description. Just like the word apostle is a job description, not a title in the New Testament, the Satan is a role or an office. It was never meant to be a name. And we're told in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, that Satan is the accuser who accuses the brother day and night before our God. And that's what's reflected in the Old Testament name. He's referred to as the accuser, the deceiver. Now let me ask you a question. What's the point of all of that piece of information? Well, the divine being described, he was created. He received an assignment. He was placed where he was placed, and he was allowed to go where he was allowed to go. Think about that as we go along, and we're going to come back to that point. Now, back to that possible reference to the musical ability. Some speculate that the Satan may have been what we might call today the choir director or the worship leader in heaven. And Daniel Block says, this is not simply one cherub among many. He was the cherub par excellence. And N.T. Wright says he may have been one of the chief guardians on the throne of God. And we pick that up with the expression anointed guardian. This is the only place in the Bible that the word that's translated as anointed here is used. The traditional Hebrew word for anointed isn't used. The word used here it isn't totally clear, but it's believed that it means to have expanded wings or far-reaching wings. And the word that's translated guardian is most commonly translated as cover, like a lid covers a box, you know? Now let me ask you a question. What does that remind you of? Well, it reminds me of the cover to the Ark of the Covenant. You see, the Ark is described in Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 through 16. The atonement cover, or the mercy seat, the place of atonement, is described specifically in verses 17 through 22. It reads, you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, and 1 cubit and a half its breadth. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered work you shall make them. On the 2 ends of the mercy seat, make 1 cherub on the one end, 1 cherub on the other end. Of one piece with the mercy seat shall you make the cherubim on its 2 ends. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, their faces one to another. Towards the mercy seat shall the face of the cherubim be, and you shall put the mercy seat on the top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you about all that I will give in command. From between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. Now, if this analogy is right in terms of perfection, man, can there be any more perfect spot than that? And he says, I placed you. Where did God place him? Well, he's saying here, you were given an assignment by me. You were allowed to go where I allowed you to go. And the reference might be to the holy mountain that follows here, or any number of places that he certainly just didn't get to go to on his own. And speaking of that holy mountain of God, what is a mountain? Well, a mountain is a high place. And a reference might be to the highest of places, to heaven itself. And he says, in the midst of the stones of fire you walked. Back to Michael Heiser. He says the stones of fire of verse 14 and the precious gemstones of verse 13 are related. This kind of description of fiery stones or shining stones, gemstones, they're stock descriptions of divine beings in the ancient world. And the link is their shininess, their luminescence. The adornment of the gemstones telegraphs divinity. All of the gems mentioned, he says, have one thing in common. They all shine, they sparkle. Luminescence is a characteristic of divine beings or divine presence across the ancient Near Eastern world and the Old Testament. The seraphs, for example, in Isaiah 6, they're described as fiery ones, and the description of the divine cherub in Eden is designed to convey divinity, a shining presence. He says this story has divinity references throughout it. The Satan was perfect in some ways, but not always, and we'll see that next. But there is a brilliant appearance in the gemstones and the stones of fire, which represents God's heavenly counsel. And the gemstones are related to the 12 stones in the foundation in the temple in Revelation. They're the ones that sparkle or are shiny. There is the holy mountain of God, which represents heaven. There's the Garden of Eden, and the cherub is a divine being. He says all of the description here is of divine entities. Verse 15, you were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. I like the way it says it. You were blameless until you weren't. Let me ask you a question. What does this verse tell us about the nature of the Satan when he was created? He was blameless. And the Hebrew word translated blameless is tamim, and it means complete. Now, what does that mean, to be complete? Well, to be complete is one of the most important concepts to an Old Testament Jew. And there's two examples. In Leviticus, the sacrificial animals are said to be tamim, complete, flawless, without defect. And they're a reflection of Jesus, who was the perfect sacrifice. The Hebrew word shalom is another word that means completeness, and we understand it to mean peace, but it implies a completeness. Well, the question is, a completeness with what? Well, the idea of shalom is to be complete with God, to be complete in God, so complete in God that there can be nothing but peace. And we can add one more note there. Many Jews who have accepted Jesus as Messiah refer to themselves as a completed Jew. And he says you were blameless in your ways, in all that you did. And again, he says you were created. And the word for created here is the same word as used in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Hebrew word is bara and means to create something out of nothing. Now, we're not told, but maybe God spoke the Satan and all the heavenly beings into existence. And this would mean, like all the other created things, God has authority over his creation, so he has authority over him. And he says unrighteousness was found in you. To be righteous means, in a sense, to be in the right with God. And to be unrighteous then would mean to not be in the right with God. And the Hebrew word translated as unrighteousness here is the word avel. Now take a look at that word. What does that word look like? It's close to the English word for evil. Now, I looked at 3 online dictionaries for the etymology of the word evil, and none of them list the Hebrew word for unrighteousness, but it sure looks like a fit to me. Now, C.S. Lewis said it was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Lewis goes on, pride is essentially competitive. It's competitive by its very nature. He says that pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only having more of it than the next man. And he makes an analogy. I can feel really, really good about having $100 if I know that you don't have $100. But once you have more than $100, all of a sudden my feeling about my $100 changes. And C.S. Lewis says it's the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition is gone, the pride is gone. And that's why he says that pride is essentially competitive in a way that other vices aren't. Verse 16, in the abundance of your trade you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Verse 16 picks up the language of verse 14. The Satan was removed from the mountain of God in the middle of the stones of the fires. He was removed from among the divine beings in heaven. And note the word abundance there. It's the same word that was translated as multitude in the reference to the multitude of idols back in chapter 14, verse 4. And we asked the question then, how many are in an abundance or how many are in a multitude? Well, I don't know, but it's the same word that's used in reference to the number of the stars in the sky in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 22. And note he says, I destroyed you. God is the agent of destruction here. David Guzik says that the Satan's strategy against man is to obscure the image of God in man through encouraging him to sin and rebel, to cause man to serve him, and to prevent the ultimate glorification of man. And this section causes us to ask the question, why is success so hard to handle? Keep in mind the subject here again is still the king of Tyre, and the abundance of his trade ruined him. And it's significant here that God didn't condemn the king of Tyre for the possession of riches, but for how those riches corrupted him. The Bible never says that wealth is evil, but it does warn us against the love of money being the root of all sorts of evil. That's recorded in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. Tyre's abundance led to excess, power, and greed. Verse 17, your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I exposed you before kings to feast their eyes on you. By the multitude of your iniquities, in unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. So I brought fire out from your midst. It consumed you, and I turned you to ashes on the earth in the sight of all who saw you. He says your heart was proud. This is the heart of the matter. The word that's translated as proud here means to be elevated, to be high or lofty. You might even say exalted. In other words, to view yourself in a high position, and only God is in the highest of positions. Why was the heart proud? Because of his beauty. Why might that be significant? Well, it's the most artificial of characteristics. As a created being, what did Satan do to acquire such a perfect beauty? Nothing. It was given to him. He didn't inherit good genes, so to speak, and he probably wasn't out getting spa treatments and beauty treatments because he didn't need it. And let me ask you a question. Isn't that the way it is with us? Everything we have, we've been given. We've really accomplished nothing on our own. And the things that we can be proud of the most artificial things. And he says you've corrupted your wisdom. Given the Satan's position, he would have had incredible wisdom, but he chose to use it for impure motives. And he says, for the sake of your splendor, this is what sin is all about, seeking your own splendor rather than the splendor of God. And the result of that is God cast him to the ground. And the word cast there implies intensity or violence even, in the sense of getting rid of something that hinders. And he paints a word picture here. I brought fire out from your midst. It consumed you, and I turned you to ashes. And it's a very descriptive picture of pride, right? It burns at you and burns at you from your core till it destroys you, and there's nothing left of you. And he says that this happened all in the sight of all who saw you. If you're filled with pride, it's noticeable to everyone who sees you. And when pride burns within you and consumes you, everybody sees it. And when your pride ruins your life, everybody sees that too. And I want to draw your attention to that phrase there, on the earth. The Satan is no longer in the highest places of God. He's been reduced to the earth. Notice the incredible contrast between the Satan and Jesus. Jesus humbled himself to come to earth. We're told in Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, that he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant and being born in the likeness of man. The Satan was banished here because of his pride. Now let me ask you a question. What does that tell us about the nature of these two, Jesus and the Satan, while they were here on earth? My wife Melba and I were watching a show the other day, and the show is set on a horse farm. And look, this is a really imperfect analogy, okay? You don't have to write to me and tell me, hey, that analogy was weak. I know this analogy is weak, but just go with me on this, okay? So this story is set on a horse farm. Now, one person is on the horse farm because it represents their family legacy. It's been in their family for years. They love everything about it. Okay, well, maybe they don't love cleaning out the horse stalls, but they recognize that it goes along with the territory with raising and training horses. One of the other characters in the story is they're on a probation work release program for a minor crime, and it's really the only place they could go. They have no experience with horses. They have no interest in horses. They have no interest in farms, but it's the only place that they could go. And the only thing that they're really qualified to do on the horse farm is to clean horse stalls, and they hated every bit of it. You see, these two people on this show had very different perspectives, and they viewed the horses with a completely different pair of eyeglasses. And in a similar manner, the perspective of Jesus and the Satan are wildly different, and the way they view people here on earth are wildly different, and I think God wants you to know that. Now, if that was a really weak analogy, let me give you a better one. The words of Jesus in John chapter 10, verses 11 through 15. Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and is not the shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep." Now note the perspectives here in this story. The hired hand that has little concern for the sheep, well, that's the Pharisees. But the wolf is Satan. The Satan is the wolf who snatches and scatters. Now let me ask you a question. What does a wolf do to a sheep when it snatches it? Well, it has lamb for dinner, right? Jesus, of course, is the good shepherd, willing to lay down his life for the benefit of the sheep if that's what it takes. And that's what it took. And that's what he did here on earth. That's why he came to earth. Verse 19, "All who know you among the peoples are appalled at you. You have come to a dreadful end and shall be no more forever." Tyre had a lot of trading partners, so they were all exposed to this downfall to some degree, and they all witnessed the dreadful end. Let me ask you a question. What does the word forever mean? It means forever. It's not a trick question. Now we're going to skip over verses 20 to 24, which is a prophecy against Sidon, which is a sister city to Tyre. But the summary there is that God uses an agricultural analogy to say he cares for us like a farmer cares for his gardens, removing briars and thorns, a description of, the nations, the neighbors around him. And in verse 25 it says, "Thus says the Lord God, when I gather the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered and manifest my holiness in them in the sight of the nations, then they shall dwell in their own land that I gave to my servant Jacob, and they shall dwell securely in it. And they shall build houses and plant vineyards. They shall dwell securely when I execute judgments upon all their neighbors who have treated them with contempt. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God." God reinforces his promises to the Israelites to live in their homeland. Ezekiel again looks forward to the gathering back in the land. He says, "I will manifest my holiness in them in the sight of the nations." Again, the nations will watch and they should learn. And he says that they shall build houses and plant vineyards. Again, an expression of the removal of opposition. I like what J. Vernon McGee says. He says that one reason that so many theologians are believed when they say that God is through with the nation Israel is because God's people are not acquainted with Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and the minor prophets. The theme song of all these prophets is that God is not through with the nation of Israel. And I would add, not then and not now, some 2,500 years later. Now let's try to summarize here. There are more things to summarize and think about in this section than we could possibly get to here, but let's try a few of them here. Why does God want us to know that the Satan was a created being? Chuck Missler makes the point that many people make one of two mistakes with regard to the Satan. They either assume that he doesn't exist, or if he does, he's just irrelevant, or they assume that he's equal in stature to God. They either assign him far more stature than he is due, or they think he's insignificant. And I think God wants us to have the proper perspective here. In the Old Testament, he isn't even honored with a name. He's the adversary, and the Satan was a created thing just like virtually everything else in the universe. He was allowed to be where he was allowed to be. He is subject to the plan of God. He may have his own plan, but God's plan will ultimately prevail. Is the Satan powerful? Yeah, absolutely. Far more than you or I. Is he infinitely powerful like God? Not even close. God is ultimately in control. Now listen to these following phrases in chapter 28. You were perfect. You were in Eden. Every precious stone was your covering. You were an anointed guardian cherub. You were on the holy mountain of God. You were blameless. What do you notice about these phrases? They're all in the past tense. Now let's think about that for a minute. What the Satan has lost is beyond comprehension. And the topic that permeates the entire book of Ezekiel is the exile. And in chapter 20, we looked at the exile in relation to Leviticus chapter 26, which essentially says that there are rewards for obedience and there's punishment for disobedience. And the exiles are living out the punishment for disobedience now. And so is the Satan. The exiles were given residence in the promised land, the most glorious of all lands here on earth. The Satan was given residence in heaven, which far exceeds the promised land. And in chapter 20, we came to understand that the exiles were removed from the Holy Land because of their disobedience. And God used the Babylonians to accomplish this, and for many of them, they weren't going back. They were going to die outside of the land. But the ultimate source of their removal, though, it wasn't the Babylonians, it wasn't even God, it was their own actions towards God. And you know what? We see the same thing here with the Satan. God removed the Satan from heaven himself. And we're told he's going to be destroyed outside of heaven, coming to a dreadful end. He's not going back. Let me ask you a question. What was the source of the Satan's removal? It was his own actions towards God. And I think that that's a very powerful illustration for us and something that we can view how we relate to the God of the universe. Here's a question. Why is the king of Tyre spoken of here with the analogy to Satan? I mean, how bad of a guy did he have to be? Well, we're told they're both filled with intense pride. And in this section, G. Campbell Morgan says we find the most graphic and illuminating portrayal of Satan to be found in the whole Bible. And beyond that, God might be saying that he is as disappointed in sin in the king of Tyre as he is in the sin of the creature that we know today as the Satan. And you see, the Bible teaches that there's really only two options. Our actions are either fully with God or they're against God. So in a similar manner, God may be just as dissatisfied with our sin as he was with the king of Tyre or the Satan. And if that's true, that would be something to think about. And of course, this whole section is really about pride. Why does the Bible speak so often against pride? It might just be the thing that is the root cause of many, if not all sin. And the theme of this lesson, I think, could be reinforced and wrapped up in James chapter 4, verse 6. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And that should be a thing that we should think about and pray about as the days go forward here. And that's the lesson that I have for you from Ezekiel chapter 28. And I look forward to our next